So, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, bonjour, buenos dias, good morgen, wherever you are. We're very happy to welcome you to this session on Voices from the Caribbean. My name is James Hospitalis. I'm the founder of Earth Medic and Earth Nurse and the former director of the Caribbean Public Health Agency. I will be both moderating and speaking at this session. We are at the end of the Conference of the Parties, number 26. And so us being at the end is saving some of the best wine for last. This is the first Conference of the Parties that has had a major focus on health with a WHO Special Health Pavilion, so that we're glad that we're able to present this session from small island states, from the Caribbean, in this health pavilion. As far as we know, it's the only full session on SIDS and the Caribbean islands, although our negotiators have been very busy in Glasgow with the negotiations and meetings. If Kishan Kumar Singh is actually in the WHO Pavilion, I'm giving a shout out to him from the Trinidad and Tobago delegation. He said he would try to be there. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So good morning again, and this session on features the voices from the Caribbean, some of the highlights and the lessons that we picked up in our landmark conference on climate change and health last month, which focused on the Caribbean. And here at the bottom, you can see the coordination committee for the conference, Earth Medic and Earth Nurse, the Emory Rollins School of Public Health, Pan American Health, University of West Indies, and the Yale School of Public Health Center on Climate Change and Health. I'd like to make special mention of conference co-chair with me, Professor Robert Dubrow, the head of the School of Public Health, and draw your attention to our conference logo on the bottom right of the screen. Today's program has 5 speakers and ending with some edutainment. I will be opening and giving an overview of the conference purpose and highlights, and then we'll be followed by Renelle, Chris Aura, Ariane, and Saria Hassan. Prior to each speaker, I'll give a brief introduction of each person so that you know who is speaking. The conference that we had last month had 3 key objectives. 1, to provide an overview of health impacts of climate change in the Caribbean and the mitigation and adaptation actions which are impediments to these actions. 2nd, to understand and prioritize knowledge gaps which define the action-oriented research and implementation agenda to reduce the health impacts. And 3rd, to foster multi-sectoral and regional North-South and South-South collaboration and innovation and sharing to facilitate implementation. This was an important conference, not only because of the numbers of partners, but because there is a large knowledge gap with what is going on with climate in the South. The recent WHO publication on research gaps showed that low and middle income countries and the small island states were hugely underrepresented in the published literature. So our conference helped to facilitate bridging that gap. In the spirit of North-South collaboration, this slide shows that the 25 partners from the Caribbean and internationally who joined forces to address the climate and health crisis. And I must give a shout out to some of our funders, including the Edward and Dorothy Clark Kemp Foundation, the Council for Latin American and Iberian Studies, the Boroughs Wellcome Fund, European Union, University of Pittsburgh, Emory School of Public Health, Yale University for Global Health, the Inter-American Development Bank, among others who financed the conference. So you can see here at a glance the many partners from the North and the South who joined forces to address this climate and health crisis that we have in the Caribbean. The economic aspects of climate have been pretty well developed and continuously being addressed. It's more recently that health has come so much to the fore. Some of the conference highlights: we had over 1,200 registered participants from 84 countries, including youth, indigenous people, the public and the private sector, civil society organizations, and academia. As seems to be the case in many climate events, we had twice as many ladies as gentlemen. We had nearly 100 speakers, and this conference was a milestone in addressing the climate and health crisis in the region, building on some of the earlier efforts, including that of PAHO WHO. We had a feast of information and inspiration. From the opening, where Prime Minister Dr. Timothy Harris, the lead Prime Minister in CARICOM for Health and Human Development, prayed that God should give us the grace to come together in one accord to care for all of creation, people and planet. And there's a must-see keynote address from Professor Michael Taylor on downsizing climate science to the Caribbean and the implications for health, in which he had a little takeaway acronym: acknowledge it, contemplate it, and take action, or ACT for short. We had 4 days of scientific sessions and special events. Here you see on day 1, we addressed the impacts of climate on health, food and water insecurity, extreme heat and health, hurricanes, which are almost our special thing in the Caribbean, vector-borne diseases such as dengue, chikungunya, and in the evening, a special event on engaging youth in the fight against climate change. This was our promotion for the hurricane event, or the hurricane session, and the panel that addressed it. I was on the Caribbean disaster response team for 8 years in the late 80s and 90s. And hurricanes, which we've been accustomed to, have really changed in the region. And we need to adapt even more to severe storms, higher winds, higher rainfall, as we saw with Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas recently. Our special event on the first day in the evening looked at informing and empowering youth to address the effects of climate change, and had 2 major tracks. One was how to integrate climate change into the secondary school curriculum, and the second in the medical school curriculum, hearing especially from the Planetary Report Card Medical Students Initiative. There are about 40 medical schools in the Caribbean, and it is part of our intent to advocate for inclusion of climate change in the curriculum. And I put a quote here from activist Priyanka Lala, who spoke at the opening, and it really took me aback. All the science and the data is useless unless the information get into the hands of those who need to act, including the youth. So this, to me, it caught my attention, and it was echoed at the very end of the conference, which I'll come back to. On day 2, we looked at the immediate health benefits of climate action in terms of air quality and Sahara dust and fossil fuels. The region is exposed to more and heavier flows of Saharan dust, the so-called Godzilla in 2020, where the dust spanned all the way from Africa to the Caribbean. Greening our cities, which Renelle Sargent will talk about a little later. Climate-resistant agriculture, better climate, better oceans. And I was happy that some of the regional institutions from the Caribbean system really gave a strong support to some of these talks that made up the session. That evening, we had an event, a special event on multi-sector collaboration in addressing the climate challenge. And there are challenges and opportunities in doing it. Former Minister Damian Greaves said, people are just not wired to collaborate around the cabinet table. They tend to compete. And so a common theme was how to join up silos. And we had a lot of good ideas advanced for how to do that in terms of training, joint meetings, mandates, and so on. I give a shout out to Kishan Kumar Singh, who is an eternal optimist and the climate lead in the Ministry of Planning and Development in Trinidad and Tobago. The Prime Minister for Trinidad and Tobago came back from the conference and spoke last weekend on the significance of this event for the country and for the world, and the need to change course, as this, where I'm based now in Port of Spain, is primarily a petro state. Day 3 of sessions, we looked at the health sector role in addressing climate change, had 2 special briefings at the beginning, the role of public health agencies and health in COP, which were led by the UK Health Security Agency, and I give a shout out to Revati Falke, the Climate and Health Unit Lead. We looked at resilient health systems, integrated health and disaster preparedness and response, which is a must in this region, which suffers from big hurricanes, and the role of government regulation. In the evening, we had a session on public-private partnership for climate action as a special event, and that really brought CEOs of insurance industry, chambers of commerce, hotel and tourism industry together, and there was a glimpsing of opportunities for win-win-win outcomes for people, for planet, and for business. Day 4 was putting it all together, how we engage the Caribbean community in research and implementation, how we communicate to the people about climate and health, looking at media, sporting events, culture, music. And we're going to share a video with you at the end, which shows that very well. Strengthening research capacity, where UWI and St. George's University were much engaged in that discussion. And then we had a closing ceremony. At the closing, to sort of sum up, a common message across all the sessions related to data gaps and to implementation gaps. We know a lot of what needs to be done. So how do we implement? And another common message was on joining up silos. In the closing ceremony, I highlight 2 remarks from Baroness Scotland, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, calling for more resources to be directed to the health sector in the many projects that are already underway. And Pro-Vice Chancellor Professor Rosemary Antoine, who echoed what Priyanka Lala said by saying quality research is most impactful when the average citizen can identify with it. From the arithmetic point of view and the point of view of the partners that are gathered, here are some of our key next steps. The conference recording is to be posted online at our YouTube, and you can access it here at this link. Mauro will be putting it in the chat as well. We want to finalize the multi-stakeholder research and implementation agenda and continue the North-South collaboration that is underway. Training and sensitization is a must. Many health professionals are aware of climate, but they're not aware of what to do, and they need training and sensitization. A climate and health roadshow is being fashioned to take the message to people, to countries and stakeholders in collaboration with the media. And here in Trinidad and Tobago, agreement was reached with the oldest television station to do a program on greening TNT. And finally, continuing with advocacy, inclusion of climate change in the curriculum, medical schools and secondary schools. So that concludes my quick overview and highlights of the conference. And now we would be moving on to hear from the other presenters. So I'm going to stop sharing. Please, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. Our next presenter is, let's get it right. It's going to be Renelle, who's talking about greening cities for better health. And Renelle is an urban planner and designer and a consultant and researcher here in Trinidad and Tobago. So we're very happy to have her speak. She was one of the speakers at the conference and was much liked by everyone. Renelle, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, James. Just give me a couple of seconds to share my screen. Are you y'all see my screen? Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much, James, for that introduction. So let me just, I'll scroll to the start. So again, hello, COP26. I'm really happy to be here this morning. As James would have introduced me, I'm Ronelle. I'm the founder of Public Space Global, an urban advocacy group in the Caribbean working on championing better, healthier, friendlier, and greener urban development. Now, in the Caribbean, many of our populations live in urban areas. In fact, 74% of our population is urbanized, and many more live not very far away from these urban areas. Our islands are very biodiverse. Many of our cities lie along the coastline, and we also have a very rich heritage of botanic gardens and parks created during the colonial period. Yet still, what we find today is that as we are developing our towns and cities, they're becoming less and less green. Current models of urban development, they're prioritizing cars, concrete, construction, and consumption. And this is really creating the sense of disjointedness and decay within our urban centers. Many of the streets are designed primarily for cars, and that really separates people from others and also separates people from the places that they want to go to. We're also being separated from nature and at the same time finding ourselves closer to many natural and meteorological hazards, closer to floods, closer to storm surges, closer to coastal inundation as well. This all really calls into question the quality of design and quality of management of our urban spaces and where and how expenditure in the urban environment happens. From Kingston to Georgetown to Bridgetown, we're really seeing that although our cities have huge significance to the health of our populations and our ability to adapt to climate change, we're not paying much attention to them. What we really need to do is to come up with a Caribbean specific definition of greening our cities that responds to some of these urban challenges. And this is what it may look like. It may mean developing a set of green principles, fundamental principles around some of these interventions. Using urban agriculture to feed ourselves, redesigning our streets, using permeable pavements, restoring some of the water channels which have been concretized for better water management in cities. It also means things like developing new horizontal and vertical green spaces like green walls and green roofs. It means in our architecture, we need to start to design for our climate, whether that's using our natural ventilation or using our natural sunlight as well. And we also need to pay particular attention to our streetscape to ensure that it's designed for active forms of transportation, whether that's cycles or whether that's walking in the urban environment. Now, those solutions altogether can really be viewed as an ecology of management strategies, which altogether under the umbrella of nature-based solutions can really push urban development in the Caribbean to more sustainable outcomes, push us closer to better health and well-being, and also push us closer to climate adaptation. Respiratory health, mental health, immunity, physical activity, and patient recovery are some of the pathways on the health and well-being side of things. But on the climate adaptation side of things, we also have carbon sequestration, better water management, coastal protection, urban cooling. And these are all pathways that some of these green solutions can lead us towards. And I should say, however, that there are many countries in the Caribbean that are beginning to look towards these types of solutions. Now, Jamaica is one really good example. As of January this year, they've actually planted 500,000 of a 3 million tree goal in 3 years. What these trees will really do is really create a healthier environment, provide a bedrock for improving air quality, and a foundation for biodiversity in the urban environment. What we've also been seeing in the Caribbean is that many of our public space designs are beginning to include both gray and green infrastructures. In Bridgetown, there's Church Village Green, which is actually using rainwater harvesting within their design. And in Haiti, there's Tapis Rouge, where within a local community, the public space is designed to incorporate water capture, storage, and distribution for local community use. In Antigua and Barbuda, we also have some really nice examples of things happening in the water space. The McKinnon's watershed is being rehabilitated using climate adaptation funding. Some of the measures that they're looking at and they have started to actually implement are retention ponds and wetlands restoration. We also have in the Caribbean a regional greening champion, as I like to call them, St. Lucia. Now, St. Lucia is one of a few countries globally that have actually included urban greening measures in their national adaptation plan. So they're looking at green roofs, urban afforestation, and natural buffers as some of the measures that they can use to help adapt to climate change. In the Caribbean as well, mobility is really an important issue that we need to look at. As I said earlier, the way our streets are designed is primarily for cars. And there are islands who are considering greener forms of mobility. Now in Barbados, there's the Barbados Trailway Cycle Route, which is taking persons from one end of the island to another. It's partially open and construction continues on that. And within the Caribbean, we're also seeing in many islands, they're installing shaded bus sheds. They're also trying to create an interconnected network of green and blue spaces to really push walking and push public transport usage within the urban environment. And we're also beginning to see moving up in the agenda electric vehicle charging stations as a priority measure to be installed in the urban environment. Now, I will say that the global climate and ecological crises, it really demands us in the Caribbean to realign our urban processes towards greener outcomes. But it's not an easy process. In fact, it's going to be a highly challenging endeavor. It will require us in the Caribbean to rethink some of the ways we have been developing our cities and developing our towns. It means rethinking how we finance and our procurement processes. It means really engaging in a process to build local knowledge and local skills around some of these green measures, to better understand some of the structural aspects of the measures, but also to understand how those measures perform in our specific climate and our specific weather conditions. But more important than that, it also means that we need to begin to really change some of the mindsets about how we treat the public realm. We need to stop treating the public realm as an afterthought in urban development. And that means changing the language and changing the values that some of our leaders, our municipal developers, even community groups and the construction sector use around how they think about the kinds of places we should be developing. And I'm going to end by saying one thing that I think is really important. If in the Caribbean we are to develop a regional definition of greening, it means that we need to pay very close attention to the governance models that we use. Those governance models need to be rooted in a recognition of the size of the islands that we're working with, in the politics of the Caribbean and the politics of Caribbean societies, but also understanding some of the historical relationships that we've had with nature. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renelle. Gosh, I could have kept listening to you, but time is upon us. I would add one thing, the heat. When I'm in Port of Spain and I measure the temperature and I measure it when I come home, where I have a lot of trees, it's between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius difference that you see in the city. Our next presenter is Professor Chris Aura. Chris is a professor of veterinary virology at University West Indies in St. Augustine, Trinidad. I guess we have to adopt him. He's been here 10 plus years now. And he has been heading up a climate change and health leaders course with support from Pan American Health and the European Union. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk just for the next few minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the experiences we've had developing these networks of Caribbean leaders across the region. And I'm going to use as an example a couple of projects that we've been carrying out over the last 10 years. And these projects have been funded largely by the European Union. And they've been collaborations between many organizations, especially, as James said, PAHO. And I'd like to give a special shout out at this stage to my colleague and friend, Professor Craig Stephen, who's been supporting these programs. Let me just say, move. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to talk about our experiences building these networks, a little bit about what we've been doing, we feel we've been doing well, what lessons we've learned and how we're applying them, and finish off by mentioning a few gaps and implementation barriers which will enable us to do a better job going forward. So these are the two big programs that we've been carrying out. The one on the left, we've been carrying out a One Health leadership series where we've trained 29 One Health leaders across 12 Caribbean countries. And then last year, we started a Climate Change and Health Leaders Fellowship program where we are in the process of training 24 Caribbean climate change and health leaders from 16 Caribbean countries. So these programs were slightly different. The One Health Leadership program was a part-time 3-year face-to-face curriculum-based program where we had 35 participants running through the program over 3 years together. Whereas the Climate Change and Health Fellowship is a part-time 12-month blended learning program where we have 6 fellows per year from 6 eligible countries. So the learning goals of the two programs are similar in the fact that we're enabling and empowering professionals from different sectors. So what about our successes? What have we been doing well? We certainly feel we've identified a very important gap, and that's empowering these professionals to make change in the Caribbean. One of the important things is to make the learning fun, because this is adult learning, and to develop great group dynamics. So we need to develop networks, relationships, and friendships going forward, so these guys can work together as we move through these really complex health issues that they'll have to address. We're maintaining a regional and country context, and this is very important, with themed workshops in different countries facilitated by local experts. And really tying the learning to tangible, real-world issues that are relevant to the learners in the Caribbean is critical. And also enabling the learners to solve real problems in a learning by doing approach by carrying out national projects as they run through the program. This maximizes the opportunities for practicing what they've learned throughout the program, maximizes also opportunities for peer-to-peer learning and opportunities for learning through shared experiences, which are all very, very important for adult learning. So what about the lessons we've learned from the One Health series to the climate change that we're applying to the Climate Change and Health Fellowship program? Well, we're running a more blended learning program. Obviously, we all need to reduce our carbon footprints, but it is very important to maintain some face-to-face workshops, because this is all about relationships and networks, as we all know, and face-to-face is critical for that. The selection process is very, very important with interview. Where we select fellows that are highly motivated, enthusiastic, and in a position to affect change. And selecting fellows also with relevant but contrasting skills and experience. This really maximizes the opportunity for peer-to-peer learning between these professionals. Smaller groups is better because this allows for personalized mentorship and coaching. In the One Health series, we had a larger group, and it was quite difficult to carry out this more personalized mentorship and coaching throughout. And reducing the program from 3 years to 1 year makes it much more manageable. As I said just before, expanding opportunities for learning by doing. So not only having the national project, but also having the opportunities to run a national symposium to bring in stakeholders from the country and develop develop the networks within the countries. More frequent teaching and learning interactions that we have in the One Health series. We have weekly online sessions, which really keeps the momentum going from week to week and maximizes, as I said, peer-to-peer learning. And very importantly, having an adaptively managed curriculum, which can be modified according to what the fellows bring to the program and also what they need from the program. And finally, as I said just earlier, including local and regional networks. So experiences are grounded in local realities, local and relevant realities. So finally, what do we need to know to enable us to do a better job? Firstly, is our training working? Do the competencies and attributes we cultivate in the individual leaders translate into positive change? And this obviously needs monitoring and evaluation post the program as the fellows are in their work. Is the behavior change that we want, is that actually happening? And secondly, is our training program optimized? What is the appropriate intensity, frequency, and longevity of the leadership training? We really need to understand more about how do we optimize this program. So the people's behaviors, so they become effective agents of change. And thirdly, we are dealing with complex, wicked problems here that require a systems approach. So how do we cultivate collective leadership, which is required for this systems approach, as opposed to creating just individual leaders who affect program and policy change within their own disciplines? We need to develop this collective leadership to have this systems change in climate change. And finally, how do we conduct this training more effectively online so we can reduce our carbon footprint? So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Please have a look at this book if you get the chance, which you can download on this link. And I'd like to just say, when I finish, that applications for the second cohort of Climate Change and Health Fellows is now open. So thank you very much, James. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Again, could have listened to you more. I liked how you focused at the end on, how to do a better job. And I like the collective impact, so that it's not just a narrow leader, but somebody who's got to work across their sector and with others. I'm now happy to introduce Ariane from Suriname, which is a very climate vulnerable country. Ariane is a biological anthropologist, doctoral candidate with the Caribbean Consortium for Research on Environmental and Occupational Health, and the chair of Stichting EnviroArt, the EnviroArt Foundation. Over to you, Ariane.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hospitalis. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. Once again, I am Ariane Friedsam. I am an indigenous environmental health researcher in Suriname. And I would like to begin by thanking the organization for allowing indigenous peoples a platform to express their thoughts and concerns with regards to climate change and how it, in essence, impacts the very existence of indigenous peoples. It is by no means an exaggeration when we say that we are at an existential crisis. Just to give you a quick review of where Suriname is, if you are not already aware, geopolitically, we are part of the Southern Caribbean, as you can see on this map. And just to zoom in a little bit, Suriname is bordered by Guyana and French Guiana, and in the south by Brazil. We are unique because economically and socially and politically, we are Caribbean, but we are also part of the greater Amazon region and also the Guiana Shield. Quite a unique area within the Caribbean. Oh, the dots you see in the map, those are all locations of indigenous and tribal communities in Suriname. And so for the talk today, I would like to highlight two key crops. The pineapple, as you might recognize, the cassava root, otherwise known as manioc. They are two key crops within indigenous and tribal communities. From the manioc, we make cassava bread. In our language, we say arepa. We also make a soup from the extract of cassava, which we call achupo. And of course, pineapple, a very tasty fruit. You can make juice from it, jam, and even wine. And so these two key crops are very vulnerable or susceptible to changes in climate and weather patterns. Pineapple is what we call a half-year crop. It takes about half a year to grow. Manioc takes an entire year. And so planting and harvesting of both of these crops are dictated by weather patterns and even animal patterns, because indigenous peoples often use the movement or the behavior of animals to indicate when to plant or harvest crops. Traditionally, women are responsible for planting and harvesting. They are thus the food providers, direct food providers within the family. And in addition, the cycling of the dry and the rainy seasons in Suriname impacts soil fertility, water management of agricultural plots, and even drinking water. And so what happens when we have extreme weather events? And I think these pictures say it all. In 2006, I think in 1 year, we had 2 extreme flooding events. Not the usual rainfall. So it was extreme rainfall, and many communities in Suriname, both in the city, so in urban areas, and in the interior, experienced extreme flooding. And as I mentioned, the 2 key crops, very vulnerable and susceptible to climate change. And so what happens is the agriculture crops became saturated with water. Indigenous peoples generally do not use irrigation methods for water management. And so you can imagine saturation with water, the manioc, which is a root, dies off. And so for that year in 2006, there were major harvest losses and there was no food for an entire year. Drinking water sources became contaminated because the flooding. The indigenous indicators I talked about, because the weather patterns change, even the behavior of the animals don't necessarily change with the weather patterns. And so sometimes even their behavior is confusing sometimes, which confuses when to plant or harvest certain crops. Because of the major harvest losses, there was a greater societal pressure on women as food providers. Many of these communities are accessible only by airstrips. And so healthcare, for example, was very limited during this time because it was not accessible. Other options for food were not available, placing these communities under extreme stress, not just for health, but food and survival. And we can talk on and on about other issues, but one of the major issues that sort of came about in the past 4 to 5 years are mental health issues. You can imagine greater societal pressure on women, but also the youth and other people for survival, which creates a greater mental health pressure to survive, to make money, and to gather food. And so my final thoughts for this presentation. So traditionally, or any nature-based society, adapting to climate change, whether it be planting behavior or culture behavior, is a very slow and steady process. And climate change is, generally speaking, not a slow and steady process. We are witnessing extreme events right now. And so there is no equal parallel evolution, so to speak, with the cultural behavior and climate change. I would like to point out that while there are many reports out there, many plans for mitigation and adaptation strategies, not all are created equal, and especially concerning indigenous peoples or any nature-based society. So by this platform, I call for a more cultural and society appropriate planning when it comes to adaptation and mitigation strategies, because one plan does not fit all. And finally, I talk about food security or insecurity, but there are so many other issues. I mentioned the water quality declines, which is the increase in vector-borne diseases. There's also an issue with environmental toxicity of mercury in our fish, in the rivers, and in our atmosphere, just to name a few. And so with that, I would like to conclude. In my culture and in my language, we don't necessarily say thank you, but we do like to express gratitude. And so how we say that is tewa po rewa amaro, and which means thank you for visiting me as I'm visiting you virtually. And hopefully I have triggered your ideas and thoughts about how indigenous people are affected by climate change. Thank you. And back to you, Dr. Hospitalis.
Thank you very much, Arioene, giving us food for thought on what happens when extreme rainfall floods the land. It was a question I asked in the conference we had last month, which crops are good for wet situations? And one of the answers was dasheen, which grows partly submerged. So sometimes we need crops for dry and drought, and sometimes we need for wet. But thank you. I love Suriname. My last trip to Palumo was very enjoyable. Our next speaker is going to be Saria Hassan, Assistant Professor at Emory University School of Medicine and leader in the Eastern Caribbean Health Outcomes Research Project. And she's been doing a great job in helping to pull together the research and implementation framework for climate change and health in the Caribbean following the conference. Over to you, Saria.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Hospitalis. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you all for this opportunity. My role today is to really describe to you one of the main outputs or really outcomes of the conference, and something we're hoping to be able to share with many of you very soon. And that is an action-oriented research and implementation agenda for climate and health in small island developing states with a focus on the Caribbean. So let me start by telling you, what was our objective in thinking about and making sure that we have a research and implementation agenda as an output. So one of the objectives is really to highlight some of the gaps that are very specific to Caribbean SIDS, both on the effect of climate on the health of individuals in the Caribbean, but also and importantly on the implementation, on implementing what we already know works to mitigate against and adapt to the effects of climate change on health. But part of the objective here is to also break down silos. People working within themselves to address areas of climate change and health are important, but we are going to be much more effective if we really adopt a multidisciplinary approach where we're engaging all stakeholders in a multi-sectoral and collaborative approach. And that's really what this action agenda is really seeking to do, is to really call on everyone to work together and hopefully define how to do that. But we're also trying with this action-oriented agenda is to really focus on the action, to mobilize individuals at all levels so that everyone can see what their role is in addressing those gaps that we've identified. And some of those individuals I've listed here that span from government to private sector, to faith-based organizations, to academia, to intergovernmental organizations, and so forth. Only together can we address a problem as large as climate change and its effect on health. And then finally, to really provide these concrete approaches to addressing climate and health in the Caribbean, both from a research and implementation and outreach and communication perspective. And the other objective is really to fill a gap in research in the Caribbean. This is a report that was just recently in the last few weeks came out from the World Health Organization identifying current trends, gaps, and perspectives for the future of climate change and health research. And this bar graph here is depicting the geographical distribution of articles by region. And the orange is Central America and the Caribbean. And so you can clearly see that we have a lot of room to go and to grow to really put more evidence out there for how we are approaching the issues of climate change and health. And this is part of what this action-oriented agenda is trying to fill. So we tried to give ourselves an operational framework to frame this research agenda. And we looked to the WHO's operational framework for building climate resilient health systems and really tried to kind of hone it down into the key areas that we felt, based on the conference, based on the experts we had presenting at the conference, were important for us to address. Leadership and governance, health workforce, the impact of climate on human health, climate resilient health systems, the environmental determinants of health, and emergency preparedness and response. And our goal here is for each of these domains to be able to identify the key gaps, identify who currently is working in this domain, but importantly, who else needs to be brought into the discussion and onto the table. Define some priority research questions, and then address what skills need to be strengthened in order to be able to address those gaps. And so where are we now in this process? So we've identified really a comprehensive process of trying to put together this research and implementation agenda. And we started with a thorough literature review and to highlight that there has already been a lot of work been done in this realm and in this area of climate and change in the Caribbean. And what we're trying to do is put together what we already know and use our conference and the experts that we brought together in the conference to further define that and identify and highlight priorities. So we've completed the literature review. During our conference, all of our participants had an opportunity to look at the draft documents from the research and implementation agenda, go into those documents during the conference and provide some comments and feedback. We've now kind of put together those comments and feedback and sent them to some experts that were really presenting at the conference and who have expertise in these domains to provide some feedback. We'll then be holding some stakeholder engagement meetings with different priority groups to think about, again, prioritization. There's a lot that needs to be done, but we will need to prioritize it. And how do we do that? We'll end with a final compilation of the report, but importantly after that is really that targeted dissemination to key stakeholders. And so what we've tried to do as we've put together the agenda is each of those components, each of those domains actually maps to one of the days that Dr. Hospitalis had outlined so nicely for what the conference covered. So each of the days maps into experts and people coming together and chat discussions that were happening and questions that were posed on that day that'll, for example, day one, feed into what we know about impact of climate on health and what we don't know and what questions our participants at the conference were posing. And so for each of the days, we gather that information from the conference and from our panelists to try to inform each of these agenda components. And then eventually what we hope to really to have is this comprehensive document that will be distilled down for each of the audiences we really think are important for them to listen. So whether it's academia, civil society, government, intergovernment organizations, indigenous groups, really emphasizing cross-island and cross-disciplinary collaboration. We'll be sure to use multiple avenues of dissemination to be able to achieve that. We'll be holding a post-agenda workshop where we'll be able to further discuss implementation and rollout of the research and implementation agenda. And then we'll have a one-year follow-up to identify challenges and opportunities and define our next steps. And so with that, I'll conclude. Again, a big thanks to everyone who's worked really hard on this conference, everyone here, for you for coming and listening and being active participants. And we really do look forward to those next steps. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, James.
Thank you very much, Saria, for a wonderful overview of the process and where we are with developing a research and implementation agenda, how the participants in the conference and the experts were leveraged. And I would say I've seen after the conference, it's a lot of the participants were stimulated to change. And I've seen in the business community here, an active group has sprung up on how business leadership can be engaged. And I think that's another one of the sectors of society we need to consult with and connect to. So we have had quite a number of speakers. And the last bit before we have a quick question and answer is to have a bit of edutainment. This is a video on disaster preparedness and response that uses culturally appropriate communication, music, dancing, very energetic, and sport that I hope I can figure out how to play for you. So I'm going to share my screen once more. Or maybe, oh, there you go. Mauro, can you play it? You look like you're on it.
Yep, I'll press play, and James, if you can give me a thumbs up if you can hear it, and then we'll just be good to go from there.
So I'm going to talk just for the next few minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the experiences we've had developing.
I think we have some other interference. Sorry, that's not. That wasn't me, James. My apologies. All right, let's try this again.
Caribbean, the match is about to start.
We are a team. We are prepared. Disaster fighters.
My Caribbean brothers and sisters, from June 1st straight to November. Prepare now, not after. Prepare now. not later. Don't wait for disaster to show love to your neighbor. It's hurricane season. Come on.
Hurricanes are coming. Did we learn from the last one? We may think we are strong, but nature's even stronger. Let's protect what we love.
Gather your water, city stay for shelter. Check up on the latest news.
Disaster fighters. Na 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 na. Let's do this together now. Hurricane fighters.
We got fight to make it better.
When the hazard's coming, we should tell each other. This is the time for us to prepare together. Look out for your neighbor, make sure the children safe. And with this team training lives, we going to save.
Flashlights, check. Food and water, check. You trim the trees, check. Check on the elderly.
Check your neighbor and your friend them. Wear your mask to protect them. Check the news to inform them. Or else you are going to end up in a problem. Have faith, prepare, stay safe, don't fear.
Disaster fighters.
Na 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 na. Let's do this together now.
Hurricane fighters. We got fight to make it better.
The disaster fighters are ready for the hurricane season.
Make a plan, 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 make a plan.
Everybody come together and we make a plan.
Make a plan, 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 make a plan.
Everybody come together and we make a plan. Secure your home.
Check,
Feel an emergency kit.
check,
Protect your pets.
check,
Check the news.
check,
Stay inside.
check,
Away from the windows.
check.
If you need to evacuate, go to the nearest
Disaster
shelter.
fighters.
Na 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 na. Let's do this together now.
Hurricane fighters.
Let's be this together. Let's do this together now.
Disaster fighters.
Na 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 na. Let's do it together now.
Hurricane fighters.
Let's be this together. Let's do this together now.
We are in this together. We're one team.
Wow. I thank you very much. It's about the fourth or fifth time I've seen that, and I really love that one. Culturally appropriate, using dance and music, make a plan, have a checklist, and lots of practical tips on what to do as we face a disaster, which in the case of the Caribbean and many other countries, it's a hurricane you're talking about. I see we've got a lot of positive comments in the chat. Thank you very much. We have, and the introducer and commentator is Darren Gango, former Trinidad and Tobago cricket captain, who is working on a different initiative with climate change and sport. We have about 6-7 minutes left for discussion and questions. So the floor is open. I don't see a Q&A box, but I did see a question or two in the chat. I'm gonna ask Georgiana, who asked me a question separately, to take the floor and ask a question. And please, again, anyone else can ask.
Hi, and thanks for a wonderful presentation to all. My question is to Renelle, and I was wondering if you could say if there are any countries in the Caribbean who have adopted or enacted mitigation policies in transport. So for example, tax incentives to promote the purchase of electric vehicles. Can I ask two other questions while I'm at it, James? I just have one question for Arion, and that question is in relation to indigenous knowledge and ancestral and traditional knowledge. In my opinion, it's a two-way transfer of knowledge, and I was just wondering if there is an opportunity for us to learn from some of the lessons that indigenous peoples have. I know that for the hurricane in Dominica, the homes that stood were those from the Caribs, which were built using the traditional knowledge. So if you could comment on that. Thank you, James. Thank you all.
Hi, thanks, Georgiana, for that question. I'll just comment very briefly on that. In the Caribbean, although it is increasingly high on the agenda, it is a bit of a mixed bag. We see some islands where there have been particular incentives being placed into the budgets. In fact, Trinidad and Tobago actually did that this year in this budget to make the cost of electric vehicles a little bit cheaper. But of course, there have been questions around whether we have the electric charging stations available to actually suit or to suit persons who want to bring in those kind of cars, and also the type of cars that have been given that incentive. It's only been given to cars below the age of 2 years, so that's one issue to consider. There are some islands, other islands that have more widespread implementation of electric charging vehicles in the Caribbean. St. Lucia is really good at that, as I call them, their regional greeting champion. And then we have other examples of countries where there have been talks about electrifying their public transportation sector in Jamaica as well. But there was a cabinet decision that actually overturned that. So it's a bit a mixed bag in the Caribbean. There is talk around it. Some countries are leading the way, but we have other islands where there's some political and governance issues that need to be worked out.
Thanks, Renelle. Anyone else? You have a question? All these smart people and we don't have questions?
Do you want me to answer Georgiana's second question?
Go ahead, Ariane.
I think it was about lessons learned, two-way street of information, knowledge sharing. So in Suriname, we have, there is something similar. The only issue is we have a diverse group of indigenous peoples with different languages and customs and cultures. And so there is an umbrella organization, the Association of Indigenous Village Leaders in Suriname. And so I do know of, they've done a lot of work with the Arawak people with climate change and adaptation strategies they themselves have formulated and implemented. But for now, it is in Arawak, because one of the issues with indigenous peoples, I don't know if you guys know, but we have a lot of oral history, oral knowledge, but nothing is really documented. And so this initiative was to document that knowledge. But for now, it's in Arawak, and I think in the future, it will be translated into Dutch, and I think at some point, hopefully in English. So some of that knowledge can be disseminated somehow to a wider audience. Hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariane. Well, I have a question, I guess it's partly for Renelle, and it's triggered by Ariane mentioned an association of indigenous leaders. Do we have an association of local government in the Caribbean and mayors of the cities that perhaps could be one of the groups we speak to or engage with, especially in the next steps with this research and implementation agenda? How do we get cities that are friendlier for active transport, less pollution, and so on?
There is an organization, you'll forgive me, I just know the acronym, I don't know the full spelling right now, but there's a CLGF, and they work throughout the Caribbean and even internationally with local government agencies and bodies.
Thanks for that. So that's perhaps one that we should put on our list of entities to consult along with others, business, faith-based, that we intend to. Well, we are at the end of the session. Thanks to all our speakers, Renelle, Chris, Ariane, Saria, and thanks to all the participants. Many people from the chat seem to enjoy it. This session is recorded, so we would be able to check it out again. Again, thank you very much and have a good day and have a good weekend.